All right, you can go ahead and open up your Bibles to Joshua chapter 7. Actually, Joshua chapter 5, I guess. I don't know why I said 7. Joshua chapter 5. And I want us to think back about, as they come out of Egypt, what their anticipation is, and how things go, and how maybe that surprised them, but it didn't surprise God. So, if they come out of Egypt and they're going to the land of Canaan, there are two major routes that go right up there, the way of the sea and the way of Shur. These are like major trade routes. Think of interstate, interstates today going right up to the land of Canaan. Why doesn't God take them right up that way? They're not ready. And what are they not? What's lacking? Faith. Yeah, trust. Faith. And God doesn't lead them that way because He's afraid when they see war that they'll become afraid and they'll return back to Egypt. Well, it's pretty clear God's right about that because He leads them down this way and brings them to the Red Sea, tells them to camp in a certain vulnerable spot. Pharaoh comes, and how do they handle that situation? We're not worried, God. We know that You are with us. Panic. Yeah, so this is the first time they feel any threat, and they absolutely fall apart. And God doesn't seem to chasten them too badly at this point. He just makes the point, shows the salvation that He's able to provide. What do when they get to the other side of the sea? Rejoice. Why do they rejoice?
God took care of the Egyptians.
The most powerful army in the world at that time, God just annihilated. Is there any doubt now that God can help them win these battles? No. All right. So they come down a little bit further, and they come down here, they get down near close to Rephidim, and they're attacked. They're attacked by the Amalekites. And how does the battle go with the Amalekites?
Well, as long as Moses was holding his hands up, they had faith and could overcome. But if Moses got tired, then the Amalekites could overtake the Israelites. So it was kind of back and forth until Moses had helpers to hold his hands up, and God guided them in.
That's right. So here's what we're learning. The most powerful army in the world, God took care of. By the way, how much did the Israelites have to do in fighting that battle? Not much. All right. Now with the Amalekites, they fight them, and how do they do against the Amalekites by themselves? Not well. And the Amalekites are not like, a powerhouse in world military. And so they don't do that great. But with God's help, I think that's the whole lesson there, is there was this physical representation that, okay, if we do this, then God will help us win. If we don't do that and we're on our own, then we can't take them. And so another faith-building lesson, right? We get down to Mount Sinai, a covenant's made. There's a lot of faith-building lessons in this with the manna and the quail and the water from the rock and all of those things helping them. How long do we spend at Mount Sinai?
9 months.
It's going to be right at a year from the time that they get there till the time that they leave. It was 9 months of building the tabernacle till the tabernacle was erected. And so then they leave, and they're headed back up. Now they're going to the promised land. A year of training. We're going to the promised land. They get up to the promised land. They send in spies. Spies come back. Great land. But what's the two big things that they're worried about? Giants. Fortified cities. And this is two impossible obstacles for them at this point. And so we can't do it. All right. A year earlier, God said, you're not ready. A year of training, they come back and they're still not ready. The faith is not there. So God said, okay, a year boot camp doesn't seem to work. We'll go how long? 40 years. And maybe we'll raise up a generation that has the faith to go in and take the land. And so you know the story of that 40-year period. There's a lot of triumphs, a lot of failures during that time. So now the 40 years is coming to an end, and so they're going to go, and they're going back up to the land of Canaan. But God is not going to lead them up the same way. He's going to bring them over on the east side of the Jordan, and they tried to go through Edom. And what did the Edomites say? Nope, can't pass. So they have to go all the way around through some really difficult places. And probably they were going to go up the King's Highway. I believe the text says that through Edom. And Edom said no, so they had to come around probably on the northern side. Tough territory there. They whine and complain. And it's looking like this generation's not doing much better than the past generation. There's still a little of that past generation left. They're dying off quickly. Get to Moab, the Moabites. What do? They kind of attacked them, but how did they try to attack them? With physical force or? Yes. Balaam and Balak, right? Tried to curse them. Didn't work cursing them, so then seduced them and get them to sin at Baal Peor. And so some more are wiped out there. Now they come around on the north side of Moab. They get to the plains of Moab where Mount Pisgah is, Mount Nebo. Moses is able to oversee the land. It's time to go in. The book of Deuteronomy is the series of speeches that take place there. And now it's time to go. Who's going to be the next leader? Joshua is. All right. And I want you to notice something. Turn over to Joshua chapter 1 because I want you to keep this in mind as we go through here. So the mantle's being passed to Joshua as the leader. And verse 16 and through 18 of chapter 1, they answered Joshua. Now this is this next generation. They answered Joshua, all that you command us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, we will heed you. I don't know if that's great. Does that build confidence or not? Did they always heed Moses very well? No. But we're going to follow you. And only the Lord our God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your word and all that you command him, he shall be put to death. Only be strong and be of good courage. So their confidence is squarely behind Joshua. They recognize that he's the next leader that God is going to be with, and we will do whatever you say to do. I want you to hold on to that and think about that, because he's going to tell them to do some things here in a little bit that's going to test that. So it's time to cross over the land. What's the problem? What's the first major obstacle they're going to have? Oh, wait a minute. I'm forgetting something. They encountered problems when they got right here. What were the problems that they encountered there? Moab didn't attack them, but who did? Sihon attacked them. And Og attacked them. What do you know about Og? King Og. He's a big guy. How do we know he's a big guy? The Bible says so. Very good. We are teaching geniuses here. Yes. That's exactly right. He had the extra large California king. And it wasn't just because he liked to have a lot of sleeping space. The idea is it's giving us an estimate of his height. What were they worried about when they went into the land? Giants and fortified cities. And you know what Sihon's kingdom had? A lot of fortified cities. How did that go work for them? Were they able to defeat them? Yes! They were able to defeat them. So the two obstacles that they were worried about 40 years before don't seem to be that problematic. They wouldn't have been problematic 40 years before if they would have had faith either. Now they come and they're about to enter into the land. What's the first major obstacle before they enter into the land? Crossing the Jordan River. It's at flood stage. And you're trying to move a nation of people across it. Is this a major obstacle for God? No. God's going to dry up the Jordan so that they can part. And do you remember how that happened? Told the priest, take the Ark of the Covenant. What's the approximate weight of the Ark of the Covenant? It's heavy. And it's got a solid gold lid on it. It's a large chest. The priests are carrying it, and they walk down, and they're to walk down into this rapidly moving river at this point. And what happens as soon as the sole of their feet touches the water? And the drain's out. They stand there. All the people are able to cross. Now, if you are on the other side, if you're over here on Jericho, I don't have this photo, I don't think, on the slides, but you could look across that plain, and here, let me go to this because we can see. All right, so they would be crossing right in here. If you were in Jericho, you can look across this plain. You could see them camped on this side. You could see them approaching, and then you would think, well, they can't cross, and then you see them cross. And this was terrifying to them because they've heard what God did to the Egyptians. They've heard how God parted the Red Sea, and now God parts their defense in the Jordan River. So now they come over to the other side and they camp right here at Gilgal, very close to Jericho, and then God asked them to do something that really tests their faith. For the past 40 years, all the boys that have been born have not been circumcised as in their wilderness. And so God says, hey, we're right here at the gates of our enemy. This is a great time for all of your soldiers to now be circumcised. What do? They do it. This generation has more faith than the last generation. When in a very vulnerable situation, they trust God and they obey His commands. And God protects them and they have time to heal up. And so now they're healed, and now it's time to go in and attack the first city in the promised land proper. You have anything you want to add to any of that?
Not to the review, I don't. Other than I was thinking about how Joshua's faith had been built along the way too, as a young man, as Moses' assistant. He had saw all of these things that God had did. So when God told him that He would be with him, he could have full confidence in that fact.
Very good. So he was a young man 40 years before. Now Caleb, the other spy who came back, we know that he's approaching 80 at this point. And so I would say Joshua would probably be somewhere maybe in the 60s to maybe 80 or close to 80. He's not like what we would think of a young man at this point. And it's a good question.
And also another thing that I was going to add to that, after the circumcision, they also took the Passover, and the manna ceased.
That's right.
As well, after they took the produce of the land.
That's right. Yep. So now God is no longer providing them every morning with manna. They're having to eat the produce of the land, which maybe is incentive to, hey, go in and take this land. And so that's what's about to happen. All right. So Jericho is the first major city. Jericho was on the route going into the land. And because it was on a major trade route, and it was one of the border or the territorial, on the territorial border, it was a well-fortified city. It wasn't a very large city from that standpoint. Imagine almost a fortress is what Jericho was. About 6 acres is what ancient Jericho was. And Jericho, from archaeological digs, we know that it had a double wall. It was a fortress. It was a very, very well fortified place. And it was there for the very purpose of stopping any invading forces from coming into the land. So this is the first obstacle that they have to approach. Now look at verse 1 of chapter 6. Verse 13 of chapter 5. It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, the setting here is Joshua is near Jericho. And I'm surmising a little bit here. But I imagine here is this military leader who knows that this is the city that we're going to have to take as we go into the land. And he's looking at this city, and he's contemplating, how are we going to take this? This has this rampart wall, a double wall, and maybe if we were looking at these walls, they would look like, to Joshua looking at this, it would look at something like this. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to take that city? So, and let me ask you this. What do you know about how ancient walled cities were taken? They would cut off their water supply. They could build siege ramps up against it.
It would take a very long time.
Usually it took a very long time. You cut off their water and you cut off their food. By the way, most of these well-fortified cities had very deep wells, so it was very difficult to cut off their water. They were also usually very heavily stocked with supplies so that they could last. Sieges, it was not uncommon for sieges to last 3 to 5 years. before finally they just starved out. That was usually the easiest way to take it. An outright frontal attack on it, such as building siege ramps, could speed that process up, but at a very heavy casualty count. And so here are the options that Joshua has as he's thinking about how are we going to take this city. But as he's considering this, or at least there as he's around Jericho, he lifts up his eyes, and behold, a man stood opposite him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, I love as I picture this. He turns around and sees this guy with his drawn sword. He approaches him and says, "Are you for us or are you for our enemy? What are you doing standing there with the drawn sword?" And how does this individual respond?
He was the captain.
Yes, that's right. I'm for the Lord, is basically his answer. I'm the commander of the army of the Lord, and I've come. And does Joshua believe him? How do you know that? He falls on his face to the earth and worshiped and said, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" All right. If Joshua is looking at this city saying, "How in the world am I going to take this?" And the commander of the Lord's army comes and says, "I'm the commander of the Lord's army." And Joshua turns to him and says, "What instruction do you have for me?" What does that say about Joshua?
He knows where it's coming from.
He knows where it's coming from. He knows who this victory is who's going to get this victory. And he goes to the right source there. He has confidence in the right source. Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandals off your foot. Take your sandal off your foot, for the place that you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. So what's going on here? Does that account sound familiar? Where have we seen that before? That's right. Who was Moses talking with? Who's Joshua talking to? That's who he thinks he's talking to. And he worships. And if it was just an angel or just a messenger of God, what do angels always say when somebody falls down and worship? Get up. But that's not what this one says. So this seems to be a manifestation of God here, speaking to him. And Joshua recognizes that. You got anything you want to add to that? Anybody else? All right. So, chapter 6, verse 1, Jericho was securely shut up because the children of Israel, and none went out and none came in. So they're on high alert here because of the children of Israel. And so what battle plan do we have for a city that is well fortified and prepared, and we're not catching them off guard, they're ready? The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and its mighty men of valor." Well, it's securely shut up. Doesn't look like it's given into our hand, but Joshua understands what God is saying. I'm about to deliver this. I'm promising I'm giving it to you. Now, here's the plan. You shall march around the city, all of your men of war. You shall go around the city once. This you shall do for 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horn before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. Then it shall come to pass, when you make a long blast on the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all of the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city shall fall flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before him. Joshua, we recognize you as our new leader, our commander, and our captain. You tell us what to do, and we'll do it. Joshua comes back and says, "Guys, I've got news for you. Here's the battle plan. Here's what we're going to do. Y'all ready? We're going to get up, and we're going to get in line, and we're going to march around this city, and then we're going to come back home and camp. And then tomorrow, we're going to get up, we're going to get in line, and we're going to march around the city, and then we're going to come back home and camp. We're going to do this for 6 days. The 7th day, we're going to get up, we're going to line up, we're going to march around the city 7 times, and then we're all going to shout, and the walls are going to just fall down, and we're going to take the city." Is this the guy that we just said we'd follow anything that he said?
That would be a plan that would be hard to put your confidence behind.
I think about Joshua coming back and trying to convince his men of this. I think about the men listening to Joshua thinking, are we really sure about this? God is setting things in order, saying, I want to see if you trust me. I want to see if you believe me. Now, is that the way that God's been dealing with them the whole time since he led them out of Egypt? Yes, it is. Do you think that maybe God would do that with us as well? That sometimes God may ask us to do something that we look at it and we say, that doesn't make any sense. There's got to be a better way to do this. And maybe He's doing that just to see if we trust Him enough to do what He says. I think that would be consistent with God's character. Which, when you run into those obstacles where you have your logic that says, I think this would be the way to do it, and God's Word says, this is the way that I want you to do it, you have to make a decision who you trust more. I think that's what we're seeing in God's character. God says, I want a people who love me with all of their heart, with all of their soul, with all their mind, and they'll trust me, they'll believe in me, they'll have confidence in me. And these are little tests along the way to see that. Any thoughts so far? Oh, yeah. Yeah. I imagine on day one that they were scared to death. Day two, they're wondering, what are these people doing? Day three, some of the newness is worn off on it. I wonder by day 5 or 6 if they're not laughing and mocking at this. What are these people doing? Not say a word, that's right. And how strange this would look to see this army come circling around and then just go back home. And then show up the next day, circle around, and go back home. And for 6 days, they do this.
And you've taught.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Very good point.
You've taught before that we see the Israelites at some of their very best at this point in time.
Yep.
The way they're eager and willing to carry out God's, and especially when it's this unorthodox instruction. Their faith is at one of the very best that we see of them.
I think that's right.
I'm not sure how close to the city they were as far as marching. But if they were led to march pretty close to the city wall, that would test their faith too.
Mm-hmm.
If they were within archery range.
Right. Being vulnerable.
They would be vulnerable to that sort of thing. So that, again, would add another element
Mm-hmm.
of, are they going to trust me? Are they going to do as I say?
Good point. I don't know that I thought about that before, but that's right.
Question about the trumpets. Were the priests blowing the trumpet that they were marching?
From what I understand, the trumpets were being blown continuously every day of the 6 days, but nobody was saying a word. And so just imagine, this would be eerie. I mean, if you were up on the wall, and it would be surreal if you were in Joshua's army, to hear the constant blast of the trumpet all the way around, but nobody saying a word. So the 7th day comes, and Joshua reminds them. And he says, we're going to march around. The 7th time he marched around, he said, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now the city shall be doomed to the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot, I'm in verse 16 and 17 of chapter 6. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who were with her in her house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. You shall by all means keep yourself from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel accursed and trouble it. But all the silver and the gold and the vessels and the bronze and the iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So here's a reminder. This is what we're going to do today. This 7th time around, we're all going to shout. The Lord's going to give us the city. But now you be careful. Be careful not to do what? Take anything. Why?
Because it's accursed.
It's accursed. Why is it accursed? Do you know?
Because they'll become greedy and not depend on God.
That's not bad reasoning. This is the first city in the Promised Land. Now, they've taken cities on the other side. Remember Sihon and Og's kingdoms. But this is the first of the Israelite cities. This is the first fruit to the Lord. All of this is devoted to the Lord. This principle of first fruits, y'all may have talked about this last quarter, but this is a powerful concept. this trust that you have, the very first thing that you have of whatever it is, if it's the harvest that you're getting your first ripe tomato, I've been waiting all winter for this tomato. What am I going to do with this tomato? I'm going to give it to the Lord. I'm going to forego enjoying this tomato, and I'm going to give it to the Lord in trust that He'll provide me more later. First city that we conquer, all of the spoil goes to the Lord. Nothing is to be kept. Everything is either to be destroyed or put into the Lord's treasury. We're not keeping any of it. Be careful that you don't take any of it, lest you be accursed. And notice what else he says. He says, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. It won't just affect you. It'll affect everybody else as well. So you make sure to behave so that we don't all have to suffer. Joshua even reminds them of that in this. And so, you got anything?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Maybe this is something that I should have picked up on before, but as I was putting this together, I was going to ask you, what exactly is the treasury of the Lord? Is that they put it in the ark, or is it something that someone kept up with, or what is it talking about that's the treasury of the Lord there?
So we know a little bit more about it later on when they get established in the land. You know, like when the temple is built, they had storehouses on the temple for it. I don't think it was being put in the ark because it's never mentioned that it's put in the ark, and the items that are in the ark seem to be specified pretty clearly. So it seems to be that probably this was being turned over to the Levites and the priests, and I don't know what it was stored in, but it was the collection of the children of Israel that was given to the Lord in that way, and so it was stored up in that. I don't know exactly where they were putting it or transporting it or whatever at this point.
And it might be a good time to point out the importance of Rahab being spared here. What's the importance of that? Anybody? And who would later come through?
Yeah. Incredible, isn't it, that here's a city that's doomed to destruction. Don't let anybody live, except for Rahab. Well, why? Well, because she exhibited faith. Let me ask you this. Do you think anybody else in Jericho could have survived if they would have exhibited faith? Yeah. God never said, He never put out the good news there that, hey, if you'll just trust me, you can live. But Rahab did trust Him, and God spared her. And I suspect that He would do others as well on that. Good point. We'll come back to that in just a second. So, seventh time around. Sorry, I'm not keeping up here. Seventh time around. By the way, let me stop right here. I like to use visuals. I think it's very helpful. But when you show visuals up there, you must remember that an artist painted that. Sometimes the artist knows the Bible really well. Sometimes the artist doesn't seem to be as careful with what the text says. What do you notice that's inaccurate about this painting? Okay, does that look like a ram's horn? No. All right, I think they've got 7 there. It seems to be 4 in the front, 3 in the back. If that's a ram's horn, that's a big ram. Maybe that is a ram's horn. I don't know. But these don't seem to be ram's horns at all. And so it's pretty clear that it was 7 blowing ram's horns. That's the first thing. And this is a side note, but I can't find any evidence. The only evidence that I see of the ark, every time it's transported in a covering. It was never exposed unless it was done outside of the instruction of the Lord. But, I mean, almost never do you see a picture of the priest carrying poles with something with blue, purple, and scarlet covering over it. Because everybody goes, what's that? So they always show it exposed. But I don't know that it was ever transported that way. To the text, it always seems like it was always covered when it was transported. So I just want to point out, I use visuals, but don't lock an image into your mind and say, well, that's exactly how, and probably all of us have done that. There's probably been something that you have always thought, well, I always thought there were 3 wise men. What made you think that? Well, that's the way it was always portrayed, in pictures or whatever. So be careful of that. But I do think that depictions are helpful, but we just need to be careful and make sure that the text guides us in our understanding of that. So, they blow the trumpets. Everybody shouts. What happens when everybody, first of all, can you imagine 600,000 men shouting to the top of their lungs while trumpets were blaring? That would be impressive. If you've been to some big ball games before, you probably get an idea. But then what happens? The walls fall. And so these guys who had such confidence in their fortifications come tumbling down. And the Israelites are able to rush directly into the city. And they are able to take the city without any trouble. How many Israelites died in this battle? It doesn't mention a single one. Can you imagine taking one of the most fortified cities in that area and not losing a single soldier in that? Incredible. How long did this siege last? 7 days. Incredibly short in this. So the wall fall down, they go in, they utterly destroy the city, and man, woman, young, old, ox, sheep, donkey with the edge of the sword. That's what God said to do. They went in and they utterly destroyed it. Who did they spare? That's right. And so they go, and verse 23 talks about the young men who had spied out, brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had, and brought out all of her relatives and left them outside the camp. They burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Joshua spared Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had. So she dwells to Israel to this very day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent in to spy out the land. So, first of all, it says they brought her outside the camp. And so you would think, okay, well, she's not integrated into the Israelite community. But then it's obvious in verse 25, she dwells in Israel to this very day. And we know, Colby already mentioned it, we know that she becomes a pretty important character in Israelite history, because she's going to end up marrying a man named Solomon, and then they're going to have a son named Boaz. And you know the rest of the story? Boaz is going to marry a woman named Ruth, and they're going to have a son, and who's going to be her great-grandson? David. And wow! Now, if you were thinking of an improbable character to be in the lineage of the most famous king in Israelite history, and then later, the most famous man in the world, the Son of God, being born, you would never come up with a Canaanite prostitute. Isn't it interesting that a Canaanite prostitute ends up being in the lineage of Christ? Why? Because of her faith. Because of her faith. And so we're learning something about God. God really values those who will put their trust in Him. And she did. And she did. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Going back to talking about the city and the walls, I read where people's houses would have been built within the walls, and the way I understood it, the fields that they farmed would have been outside the walls. But the way I've always pictured it, very shallow-minded, when I imagine these walls falling down, would be like you see in one of the youth Bible classes back here, where it's just like a piece of cardboard falling or something, or a piece of wood, you know. But do y'all know what these walls would have been built out of? Rock, huge rock. So as I got to thinking about this, as these walls fell, that would have been some sight to see. These big, huge boulders. And you were talking about none of the Israelites being killed. I mean, you know, you would think that could have just happened by accident.
Yeah.
With such a...
Right. Yeah. So, glad you mentioned that. Let me mention a few things about Jericho here. So the walls fell, but Rahab's house was built on a wall, but it didn't fall. It didn't fall. And how does that happen? Well, God's protection of her. So it wasn't just the Israelites who said, we won't kill her. It was God who said, I won't kill her either. And so her house did not fall there. Some things to note about Jericho from the text. We already mentioned the siege only lasted 7 days. The walls fell flat, or the Hebrew word says it fell beneath themselves. That's not normally how walls fall. And so if these fell because of a battering ram or something like that, it wouldn't be described that way, I don't believe. Rahab's house was still intact. The city was burned with fire. We saw that. And no spoil was to be taken. Now, that's what the Bible text says. Now, I want to compare that with what John Garstang discovered in the 1930s when he excavated Tel Jericho, and some of the things that he noticed there. Now, he was a believer. He believed that the Bible was accurate, and so that has cast doubt with some people. Well, if he was a believer, then he only interpreted it in the way that he wanted to believe it. But still, I mean, he's got photographs and he's got things that show this wasn't like he just made this up in his mind. But I want to notice some things. So here's what he found. He found that Jericho had two walls. It had an outer wall and it had an inner wall. And in the excavation, this outer wall, he was able to find the the bottom part of the retaining wall of that. So here's what it would have looked like. So here's the inner wall, here's the outer wall. You had this retaining wall, and then above that you had a wall. He estimates that in its tallest point, this wall was probably about 40 feet tall. Yeah, 40 feet. That's pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. This part of the wall was still intact. Here's a picture of one of his workers standing next to that bottom retaining wall there. What he found, oh yes, there were houses between the walls. This is that outer wall, and I don't know, I guess this is that inner wall and the houses in between it. And so he was able to excavate down and find places where the houses were intact. We'll come back to that thought in just a second. But what this is his drawing, and this is, let me describe what this is. This is the retaining wall right there. That's what he discovered. Do you know what this is right here? Anybody want to guess? Yes. These stones right here, what he found is they were laid out this way as if they collapsed outward and fell down at the bottom. Now, if you've got a 40-foot wall, we were talking about building siege ramps or mounds. What's the purpose of that? So you can scale it, right? So that you can go up it. The problem is you've got to get within range to pile dirt up there to do that while they're shooting and dropping things on you. And so but what happened here, apparently, according to what he found, is this wall fell down and made a nice little ramp that could have been easily scaled. What did God say would happen? The walls will fall beneath themselves, and every man shall go straight up. And what he found was, well, that would be very, very plausible to do because all of the debris of this was laid down to make ramps. And I found this photo or this depiction of this where the wall would fall and actually make ramps going up into the city. And so that's what he found with that. Something else that he found was that a small part of the northern wall, all of that was pretty consistent all the way around except in the north. And in the north, there was a small section of the wall that was still intact, that had not fallen and not destroyed. And it was a part of the wall that had houses in it. What would that make you think of? That must have been where Rahab lived. And of course, we don't know that, but that seems to fit with what's there. Also, what he found was large quantities of stored grain still in the. Why do you think? Why would I even point that out? They had plenty of food, so they weren't starved out. What else?
Most everybody would have taken it as spoil.
That's exactly right. Especially you've got people no longer being fed by manna. They would take it as spoil, but this wasn't taken as spoil. So they weren't starved out, and it wasn't taken as spoil. Interesting. Something else he discovered was that the city was obviously burned because there was about a 3-foot layer of ash everywhere. And this whole, he was showing the depth of the ash there. So the whole city was burned in this. Now, putting that all together, what do we find? Well, the city was strongly fortified. Did the Bible say anything about that? Yes. All right. It was a short siege. Bible say anything about that? Yes. The walls were leveled. Bible say anything about that? Yes. The city was not plundered. Very interesting. That's what the Bible says as well. The city was burned. The Bible says that it was burned. Now, I don't ever want to go to archaeology and say, that's why I believe that God exists. But what is fascinating is when you read an account like this, and then they go and they dig in that location, and what they find is the exact thing that would happen there that doesn't make sense otherwise. Because any invading army would plunder the city and would take all of that stored grain. And it doesn't make sense if battering rams are used and things like that. Usually the walls cave in, not fall out. And so it's just interesting to put that together there. And since we do have some archaeological evidence for that, I wanted to point that out. Any thoughts?
I guess kind of looking at the very end of that chapter, and you can go over that if you want to, but verse 26 and 27 talks about, I think it's 26 and 27, talks about the man that rebuilds Jericho being accursed.
Yeah.
Is that, I noticed in Bob Waldron's book that, I believe it was in the days of King Ahab,
That's
maybe,
right.
that a man finally did rebuild, and he was accursed. But would he have moved to a different part of the area to have rebuilt that, or would that have been part of those ruins that you were, I wonder, looking at as well?
I think it would have been part of those ruins. My understanding is that very shortly thereafter, I think we'll read about this in the text, very shortly after the invasion and conquest, there was a village that was rebuilt very close to this called the City of Palms. Yeah. And so that area was re-inhabited and a village was built there, but this exact location was not rebuilt until the days of Ahab. And that's interesting because you would want to build here. You've already got a good location. You've already got foundation of a lot of things to build on. But nobody builds there for a long time until the days of Ahab. What do you know about in the days of Ahab? Yeah, Ahab was a wicked king. Does it surprise you that in those days somebody would say, who cares about that old outdated curse of God? Well, I'll build there. That'd be a great place. And guess what? The curse of God was still active. And the man who built it lost his first son when he laid the foundation and lost his last son when he hung the gates of the city, just as Joshua had said would happen. All right, in the last few minutes, unless y'all have something else, a thought occurred to me. A thought occurred to me about Rahab. That's what I'm trying to say. And I want you to think about that she has this promise from these spies that if she will leave the scarlet cord out her window, that they will spare her life and anybody who's in her household. And so the time comes, and she's waiting inside. And there's a loud trumpet blast, and the walls fall. But her house does not fall. And then, I don't know if they knocked on the door or if they kicked open the door. But men come to the door, Israelite men. And they say, you, come. And maybe she wonders, are they going to kill me or are they going to keep their word? And they keep their word and let her out. What does that remind you of? Does anything in that seem similar? We live in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. Do you know what we're waiting for? We're waiting for a trumpet blast. And we're waiting for someone to come and say, you, come. And what's going to happen to the rest of the world? It's going to be destroyed by fire. I've never thought about that before. But just thinking about the anticipation that she would have had, recognizing I've got a promise. The promise is that if I would do what they said, that they would spare my life. And when the trumpet blast came, they kept their promise. And I was just thinking about the similarities. That's what we're doing too. We're waiting for a trumpet blast, and we're waiting for one who has promised to spare us and to take us from this world and destroy the world by fire. And so looking forward to that day and longing for that day, we live righteously and soberly, preparing and thinking about that. So I just thought that was an interesting little similarity there with that. All right, anybody have anything else? Things are going really well right now, aren't they? As a matter of fact, Joshua's fame spreads. Children of Israel, as you said, were at their best at this point. And wow, what a way to start the campaign into the land of Canaan. Things are growing great. Didn't lose a man and took one of the most fortified cities in the land. We'll see how this continues next time. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.